Tēnā koe. My name is Jo Kelly and I'm the Chief Executive of the Centre for Sustainable Finance, Toitu Tahua. Welcome to the recording of the first part of our 5-part webinar series, Unpacking Global Trends in Taxonomies. The Centre for Sustainable Finance was established to accelerate progress towards an inclusive, equitable and sustainable financial system in Aotearoa New Zealand. One of our strategic priorities is advancing common definitions, data, and standards for sustainable finance that are both locally applicable and internationally aligned. The purpose of this series is to support greater understanding of the potential benefits and drawbacks of a sustainable finance taxonomy for the Aotearoa New Zealand economy. Over the course of the 5-part webinar series, we will hear from local and international experts on lessons from taxonomy processes in other jurisdictions, and we will explore their relevance to our context here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We will learn from our international colleagues and better understand what approaches will best serve our economic, social, and environmental interests, which includes aligning with international definitions and expectations. We want to ensure that our financial system is resilient in a low-emissions global economy. Aotearoa New Zealand is reliant on international capital and export markets. With over 30 taxonomies emerging globally, we need to understand how to harness their power to direct capital to truly sustainable economic activity, while leapfrogging the lessons hard learned in other regions. So we are starting with a fundamental question. Would a sustainable finance taxonomy benefit New Zealand Inc? Welcome. Before we get started, I would like to warmly welcome and introduce our speakers today. David Woods is a professional director and Deputy Chair of New Zealand Green Investment Finance. David is also a member of the New Zealand National Advisory Board on Impact Investing and the Centre for Sustainable Finance. Pip Best is an EY partner and leader of EY New Zealand's Climate Change and Sustainability Services team. Pip is on the EY team helping to develop the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. She is also on the board of the Centre for Sustainable Finance. David Lewis is the founder of Novus Consulting, which is a social enterprise aiming to help accelerate the transition towards sustainable investing in Aotearoa New Zealand. David was the lead author on the Centre's 2022 research, which was undertaken in partnership with IGCC and Mindful Money into progress on net zero investor commitments in Aotearoa New Zealand. And Isobel Bruun-Kiaer is a Senior Policy Advisor for Sustainable Finance at the Ministry for the Environment. Isobel is a close collaborator of the Centre for Sustainable Finance, and she has held responsibilities for the National Adaptation Plan, Emissions Reduction Plan, and the funding and financing dimensions of both of those. So I welcome you all today, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. And with that, I'll turn over to David, our moderator.
Thank you, Jo, and welcome everybody. And just to reiterate what Jo said a moment ago, as questions occur to you, we encourage you to post them in the chat, not in the Q&A. And remember that this is being recorded so that people who've missed it can listen to it, or you can all listen to it a second time. So let's start. As Jo just said, there are 30 emerging taxonomies. What is a taxonomy? What's a sustainable finance taxonomy? What problem is it meant to solve? And perhaps first, David Lewis, would you like to take a stab at
that? Yeah, kia ora koutou, and thank you, David and Jo. So what is a taxonomy? It's a framework, it's a set of definitions, a sort of labeling system that defines what good looks like across different activities in an economy. Despite the name, it's got nothing to do with tax. And for an environmental taxonomy, which is the current focus, it's defining what good looks like for the environment. So it allows investors and companies to assess which activities and projects are environmentally sustainable subject to an objective framework. But there are also social taxonomies being developed. So green taxonomy, it's essentially a disclosure tool. It does not in itself restrict or forbid any activities. So it's a bit like sort of safety ratings for cars or energy ratings for fridges, but it's focused on investment products. So what's the problem it's trying to solve? At a high level, everyone on this call is probably aware, unsustainable elements of the economic system, and that's clear through what we're seeing with climate, breaches of planetary boundaries around nitrogen and others, and the related biodiversity crisis. Coming down, slightly lower level, we do have the technology to address a lot of these sustainability challenges. The issue is to try and deploy them at scale and quickly. So that requires a huge amount of financing. The UN has recently estimated 4.2 trillion a year US dollars from here until 2030, and that is over and above current plans to ramp up financing across the globe. And so governments, corporations, and individuals all have a role to play in filling that sort of financing gap. So how does a taxonomy and all these definitions help? So these definitions can help investors, businesses, policymakers as they move to cut emissions and scale climate solutions, take other sustainability actions, and they'll increase confidence in the way that financial products are labelled, and that helps counter greenwashing. We've got this huge wave of products calling themselves sustainable at the moment in the investment industry. 36% of the total globally, according to the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance. So that's around $35 trillion. But paradoxically, most of that isn't directly contributing to sustainability challenges in a meaningful way, despite those products being called green in some shape or another. So this lack of clarity on what is actually a green investment creates uncertainty, creates high transactions costs, and the risk that local markets don't embrace green investments due to this lack of credibility. And it creates nervousness around being exposed to accusations of greenwashing or greenwashing. Finally, a quick couple of comments on coverage in regions. New Zealand's slightly later in the game to other countries. We've now got a bit over half of global GDP that's developing a taxonomy, 30 globally, as Joe mentioned. China, the EU, UK, Japan, Singapore, 660 million people up in ASEAN region, all taxonomies in development there. But most taxonomies globally are not looking to map the whole economy, at least initially. Current focus generally on key sectors with the largest environmental impact and focusing on larger businesses rather than smaller businesses. So the EU's program, for example, covers around 40% of the activities of listed companies in sectors responsible for about 80% of emissions. So that's a long enough opening comment from me. Back to you, David.
Thanks, David. So that's, I think, really helpful and insightful. I think it's all about sets of standards, why we might need them, what happens if we don't. As you've said, primarily at the moment, taxonomies are environmental. There's some social work being done. And primarily, I think, two targets, investors and companies exporting, as Joe said at the beginning. So Pip, perhaps you could give an example of how taxonomies work in practice.
Thanks, David. It might be best to maybe start of an example that's not in the finance world that we're probably all familiar with, and that's probably in the product space. And we have things like certified organic and things like that we're quite comfortable and used to. And really, it's taking that concept and applying it across a broader spectrum of, I guess, environmental activities, and applying it to companies or activities that companies do to then feed through into, I guess, the world of finance, which could then flow on to things like products as well. So that's, I guess, an example that we might be familiar with. In terms of, I guess, the evolution in the finance space, and this probably highlights the need that the taxonomy is trying to fill as well. We have seen these types of taxonomies, and we get a lot of debate about that word. So a definition per se that have evolved, and they've evolved as the science on things like climate change become clearer, probably more accurate, and also highlight the increased rapid transition that we need to embark on. So highlighting the urgency of really the challenge we're trying to address. And as we've seen this kind of play out, we started off with, I guess, definitions of what might align to a climate future that probably no longer are fit for purpose. And that can be as broad as things like potentially the word carbon neutral, where we're using offsets to say something's carbon neutral, which really I think quite quickly is becoming kind of out of date with the science. And other things like that. I mean, there are lots of ESG tools, etc., which have all sorts of different criteria, which feeds to a conclusion that someone might then say it's a green or sustainable product. So that's probably kind of the first evolution of this. What I guess we're seeing come into place now is more detailed descriptions of actually what are the specific economic activities that do align with a 1.5 degree future, or what are the activities that will transition us there? So maybe useful in the interim, or we see as needed in the interim, particularly on a country specific basis. And in that space, we've seen this, I guess, evolution of things like carbon neutral through to kind of ESG ratings to now get to things like there's a couple out there, like obviously the EU taxonomy is probably one of the more developed pieces, which is now feeding into mandatory reporting requirements at the company level in terms of what percentage of investment dollars are being spent on activities that align with this EU taxonomy and that don't, so that investors can understand what that business is actually, I guess, contributing in terms of sustainability. And then probably a lesser known standard, which is called the climate bond standard, which again specifically focuses on climate mitigation and tries to provide an objective definition of what does align with a 1.5 degree future. So there's a couple in existence, but really this highlights, I guess, the challenge that these taxonomies are trying to address, which is what are the economic activities that really do align with the best science and research we have in terms of a sustainable activity, and what activities align to basically this transition we know we have to undertake. So I'll stop there, David, but that's I guess an initial take on some concrete examples of what this is.
Thanks, Pip, and that's also very useful. You've outlined a number of things where investments are conforming to sets of standards, but what changes if we have a New Zealand taxonomy and everybody has to conform to one set? You talked about certified organic. Some people may remember a few years ago that Cadbury's chocolate couldn't be exported to the EU because they weren't allowed to call it chocolate anymore. So those are the kinds of standards that companies and investments are having to deal with. And I guess one of the big issues for us in New Zealand is also, have we got the data to have a proper set of standards? But let's look at it for a minute from the point of view of companies rather than the investment side. Isobel, from your perspective in MFE, what difference would the New Zealand taxonomy make for New Zealand exporters?
Well, I think that from a New Zealand perspective, what we're hoping to do is really remove the barriers, and how can we really support businesses, whether they're working domestically or internationally, to reorientate capital towards those green economic activities that Pip was talking to, green outcomes and objectives for New Zealand. Yeah, I think it's really about how do you create that certainty and that clarity so that there's a way to navigate through the system and you know that you're not necessarily going to be at risk of greenwashing or anything like that. So really providing that security within the system of knowing what is green so that you can look at things in a more comparable way.
Yeah. Okay, because I think then at a detailed level, we get companies exporting to Europe and to UK supermarkets and having to conform to certain standards, and what difference would a taxonomy make and how is all that? Now, that's something that it's not really within the government's purview at the moment to sort of answer that, but the government has published a national adaptation plan, and one of the related actions in that plan was to support the development of definitional tools to encourage greater investment in green projects. The ministry is the lead agency on this work program, which has a time frame over the next couple of years. How's the work going, Isobel, and what should we expect from it?
Oh, thanks, David. I've got a couple of slides actually to speak to this, so I might ask Nikki to pop them up on the screen and I can speak through them. But really, I will just start with a bit of context for where the NAP action came from the National Adaptation Plan. So the National Adaptation Plan set this specific policy mandate to create definitions through a taxonomy, and they set this this mandate sits within kind of an existing legislative landscape, which includes the emissions reduction plan, includes disclosures regime. If you change to the next slide, then everyone will be able to see kind of what I'm speaking to. But also some existing policy landscape that we have, you know, around sovereign green bonds, around the ASFI initiative, but also the broader funding and financing, the climate transition work programme. There are other drivers as well for this, just putting that in the picture around, you know, the growth of international taxonomies, which Pip and David have already spoken to, the best practice that is coming out from that, well, that policy learning, but also the work that's happening domestically around strategic partnerships and relationships. For example, working with the centre to better understand the demand from the finance sector and businesses and understand that this is a barrier. Another key kind of landscape piece is understanding New Zealand's genuine unique characteristics and what that means for something that's fit for purpose for New Zealand. So I'll just jump onto the next slide to give a bit of an overview of what, when I say the word taxonomy, what am I talking about? And this goes to Pip's point earlier around, you know, there are lots of different approaches, but it's all effectively around definitions. So we consider it in two key components. One is the dictionary and the definitions, like setting out what is green. And on the right, you can see that there are some examples. You know, some countries use standards and technical screening criteria. Others look at principles-based, which might be linked directly just to a policy ambition. But what we're seeing is best practice is really a preference for science-based and links up to the Paris Agreement, particularly around mitigation, which is where a lot of the development has happened. The second component is around the structural component, or, you know, the enabling factors. So what those supporting conditions look like? And that can either be voluntary or mandated, and we've seen that across a number of the international examples. There's a third one that we're quite aware of as well, which is regional taxonomies, looking at the ASEAN space and Europe, and looking at what that means for the broader market when it comes to that sustainable finance system. And just at the bottom there, I noted that, again, echoing Pip, to say that to be taxonomy aligned, a lot of international taxonomies require an economic activity to meet a certain threshold, which is where that feedback loop to the definitions between the enabling conditions comes back. If you go on to the next slide, I might just cover off like the why and the what does taxonomy mean for New Zealand in terms of the NAP action. So overall, we're really looking to remove barriers, like I said, David, in relation to your previous question, and to reorientate capital towards those green economic activities, outcomes and objectives. The NAP action itself is designed to help businesses investing in both adaptation and mitigation, to protect against greenwashing, and to support greater investment in New Zealand's climate resilient projects, including nature-based solutions. To David's earlier point, we've heard that the lack of clarity, certainty, and a really fragmented landscape around how to articulate and verify what is green is a barrier. And we also know that the business community and the finance sector have the best understanding, the most tangible understanding of how they are already being asked to navigate the international context and the application of international taxonomies to New Zealand. And we really want to kind of emphasize that these insights will be critical to the design of a taxonomy in New Zealand to ensure that it's fit for purpose, to make sure that it really fits well within that landscape. So with that in mind, we're looking to determine and design this in a collaborative way, but I'll speak to that in a moment, because before I cover off next steps, I just want to have a bit of a, add a few points on what success might look like. Like I've already mentioned, the form and function of a New Zealand taxonomy hasn't yet been determined, and we're hoping to do that in a collaborative way. But we do know that success will depend on it being fit for purpose for New Zealand's unique characteristics and the New Zealand market. It will also depend on having the right people and the right perspectives involved in the design and looking at who's going to use that. It will rely on trust, confidence, buy-in to ensure that green in New Zealand is aligned with those domestic and international priorities, policy and objectives, and the science that goes alongside that. Also looking at clarity and certainty of definitions of what is green in New Zealand, so that when that label is used, there's confidence it's being allocated in the right places to green and sustainable activities. We want to support, it needs to support comparability between investments, otherwise it's not a very helpful tool. And then lastly, you know, that current and future international investment in New Zealand isn't hampered by giving international regulators and financial institutions assurance that it's really going in the right direction. The other thing is we do have a milestone, I guess this is part of success, in the NAP around June 2024 to have something publicly available. So that's one of the milestones that we're really looking to for next steps. I'll just get you to go to the last slide and cover off what that next piece looks like. Firstly, we're really grateful to the Centre for setting up this webinar so that we can start this dialogue, because next step is really going to be building that ongoing relationship and collaborative approach, bringing public and private collaborators together to help to establish what the design of a New Zealand taxonomy needs to look like, and who's going to use it, or what that kind of application component looks like. That will involve establishing the foundations around that appropriate form and function, articulating New Zealand's unique characteristics, particularly around Māori outcomes, Māori economy, Indigenous principles, any specific sector considerations, but also exploring alignment internationally and working with international partners to make sure that we're on the same page and we're looking at interoperability and comparability as well. In terms of the timeline, you'll see I've just put a massive box between 2023 and 24, which really speaks to, we want to start to co-design what that picture looks like in terms of how do we collaboratively design the development approach, what do the supporting governance and advisory structures look like, and how do we establish the scope and confirm the principles and application before we launch into the kind of sector-based definitions, the definition development, and those conditions for application. Yeah, so hopefully that provides a bit of an update on what's coming up. I just ask everyone to look out for invitations coming up, because we're really looking to build momentum over the next few months and ensure there are more events and more opportunities for discussion so that we can get the right people in the room and set up those structures to support this work.
Thank you, Isobel. That's tremendous amount of detail in those slides, and you can see from Joe's comment about 30 taxonomies at the beginning and your first slide the way many of these codes are being evolved worldwide. You made the point in the first slide also that some are voluntary, some are mandatory. Which are we going to, if we did this in New Zealand, which would it be? Does it really make a difference for capital coming into the country as well as for exporters exporting? And those are things that we will talk about both here and in the next ones of this series of webinars. We thought we couldn't do it all at once. There's been a lot of criticism. There's been a lot of people saying we don't need one in New Zealand. There are enough of these going on elsewhere. Can't we just lift and drop from somewhere else? So perhaps David and then Pip, you could give your perspective on whether that's a valid argument or not.
Yeah, I mean, I might start. I think, there might be a role to play in New Zealand taxonomy, as it's determined over the next couple of years to lift a lot of material that has been developed overseas and take what we think are some of the best aspects of some of the very detailed work that has already gone on in many other jurisdictions, and yes, apply that in New Zealand. So yeah, we may not be developing, our own program and our own set of definitions, bottom up, sort of line by line. So yeah, absolutely, I think we can use some of that. They are complex, and some people criticize taxonomies for being complex, but my perspective is that sustainability is complex, and we can't keep ignoring it. We do that, at our peril, and at our children's peril. So we've got to try and deal with that complexity as best we can. Yeah, that complexity can be a challenge for small business, but there are often carve-outs in the initial period for small business around having to apply and report on some of the criteria. That's certainly what we've seen in Europe. Yeah, but for me, despite some of these criticisms, it's critical that New Zealand gets on board with it. We're not early. We have a huge reliance on foreign capital, 9% current account deficit at the moment. That's a bit cyclically high, obviously, but sort of 4 to 5% over time. So we need offshore investors to be confident in what New Zealand is doing around the sustainability agenda, and having a robust taxonomy is going to be a key component to that. Over to you, perhaps, Pip.
Thanks, David. And I guess the other piece and the uniqueness within New Zealand of the Maori culture and heritage and the factors that we need to include are quite important as well. Pip, I said I'd go to both of you, so perhaps you've now had a chance to listen to what David said, and you can say the same or different things.
Well, I would agree with the key challenge is that complexity versus kind of, I guess, the ability to implement this and the challenges it causes. And maybe I can speak to the Australian work we've been doing, which is a similar, I guess, place in terms of kind of setting up the foundations for what this may look like in Australia and what is relevant for that situation, which again are learnings that probably are very applicable to New Zealand. However, you obviously have to overlay that with the specifics of Aotearoa New Zealand's economy, etc. But when you get into this, the first thing that most stakeholders will say is this needs to be science aligned, which is obviously the problem we're trying to overcome, which is what does sustainability mean scientifically? Like what can we actually do that is sustainable environmentally? And as soon as you delve into that, the first thing you start to realize is we would probably all say there's lots of systems that are involved. There's lots of considerations and topics like biodiversity, water, pollution, circular economy, waste, climate mitigation, climate adaptation. So already you're getting quite a long list of things that you need to make sure that you're first of all not doing any significant harm, which is a very taxonomy term, and then to show that you're actually contributing to sustainability somehow, show that you're providing some benefit in at least one of those areas. So even at that point, it's getting quite complex. Now, when you actually see the EU taxonomy, which has gone through that process I've just set out, and it's done it for each economic activity it covers, you very quickly get to an unwieldy document. That is very, very technically heavy. And the obvious question is then the cost of actually implementing this into each company's CapEx decision-making process, really. Like before we invest money in something, how do we make sure it meets these long definitions? So this is the critical challenge, right? Like you want it to be science aligned, but yet we need it to be implementable. And that is probably where the most concern comes from, particularly for a smaller economy, we might argue, like New Zealand. However, I guess the other end of the spectrum is by not doing this, first of all, are we saying that we don't want a sustainable economy, or it's not important enough to actually spend the effort developing the definitions? There's probably a very debatable point about are these mandatory or voluntary, which again is quite interesting. But then the other part for New Zealand, as David said, we're very heavily reliant on international capital, and we do have the likes of Europe mandating reporting against the taxonomy. And are we just saying, well, this is too complex for us, therefore we don't, we're not going to understand what this would mean for us, and that doesn't potentially lead to a very good outcome for the attractiveness of investment in New Zealand from the organisations that are captured by these other taxonomies that are coming in place. So that's probably the conundrum that most countries are dealing with. And if you'd like, David, I can probably just delve into basically the conclusions Australia got to on some of those challenges, which is a report that was recently released.
Yeah. In one moment, but if I could ask you a different question first, Pip, you said at the start it has to be science aligned. Isobel's slide said some are science aligned and some are principles aligned. Why do you say science aligned as opposed to principles aligned for us in New Zealand?
I think you'll find that those principles will be science-based as a number one, but the standards that are principle aligned are the ones that probably don't go into as much detail, so they're higher level. And that is, again, to address that challenge about detail versus complexity. And I guess the challenge is where you do have high level principle based taxonomies, it does open up the scope for what does that actually mean, subjectiveness, really. So the more detailed you are, the less subjective something becomes. And again, I guess that's that challenge.
Okay, thank you. Now to foreshadow the question you started to answer before I asked it, which is Australia's doing some work already. We're going to have a separate session on the Australian taxonomy and the status it's at in 2 weeks' time, but perhaps you can give a quick trailer for that show, if you like.
That's a great place to start there. So I will be brief, but I guess some of the again, this was the complexity versus usability was a key challenge and consideration. So where Australia's up to is they've basically set out recommendations that which will set out the design parameters for their taxonomy. And the other key challenge is the governance of these taxonomies, because there has been some challenges internationally about setting out with great ambitions around science aligned, etc., and then potentially concerns around lobbying groups, etc., being involved to then maybe change the actual resulting taxonomy. So that was the other big issue that was addressed. Well, one of the other big issues. I won't delve into this too deeply, but for Australia, it obviously has a different economic structure than New Zealand. Well, similar in some ways, different in some ways, and then New Zealand has other considerations as well. But for Australia, that they did decide there was a need at this point to have almost a traffic light system. So activities that just do not align, activities that are already sustainable in how we define that, and then transition activities which we know we're going to need to get us to a fully sustainable economy, but maybe not part of this longer term economy or direction if we get to a sustainable economy. So they are basically developing their taxonomy to help drive capital to the transition to a sustainable economy, and they will use, or they are planning on using basically a traffic light system that will help them say this is already there, this is part of the transition, and this is not part of the taxonomy.
Okay, thank you. Now we've got a question in the chat asking whether Australia and Canada are including Indigenous peoples' perspectives, and if so, what can we learn from them? Maybe, Pip, I'll give you a second to breathe and ask Isobel for her perspective on that, and then come back to you. Isobel?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it's something that I don't have very much information on just yet, but it's something that we're absolutely looking to explore in that step of like speaking to international partners as well. But absolutely, Māori outcomes for a New Zealand taxonomy is a critical component, and and I think also kind of the value add. If other taxonomies are looking at reorienting credit or investment towards certain sectors of the economy that they want to see grow and develop, then there's also a question in New Zealand around how do we use a taxonomy to support a Māori economy as defined by Māori, and what does that space look like? So it's not necessarily, I think there's a place for New Zealand to understand what we want those key outcome areas to be and to use the taxonomy to support that. But I might pass back to you, Pip, because you might know a little bit more than me on this.
I
Okay,
actually
Pip,
have, I guess, a bit of a similar answer, which is this is probably one of the areas that Aotearoa New Zealand would spend the time to almost develop this specifically for our situation, because although it's considered elsewhere, I don't think it's something that is easily. It's one of those areas that basically is probably not easily transferable, and will need to be thought from basically a first principles place for New Zealand. That would be my answer to that question.
Thanks, Pip. We've been talking throughout, I suppose, on both the investor perspective and the company perspective. And there's another question in the chat asking if a New Zealand taxonomy might actually complicate things if EU asset managers have to be taxonomy aligned for their own taxonomy in the investments they make. If ours isn't completely aligned with theirs, will international asset managers still be able to invest in New Zealand assets? David, maybe we'll give you that one first.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And yeah, it would be very important to ensure that a taxonomy in New Zealand is aligned with global standards as much as possible. And there are a couple of global initiatives already underway to try and develop, common sets of global standards that are really looking to address this challenge that's been well highlighted. So there's one called the Common Ground Taxonomy, where EU and China are working together on common definitions, and another piece of work by the IPSF, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. So yeah, I think that's a valid concern. We wouldn't want to create something that excludes a significant pool of capital like Europe. But I think there are, ways that that could be addressed.
But a New Zealand issuer like the local government finance agency, for instance, saying we're issuing bonds that conform to the climate bond initiative standards may not be enough. You've got lots of these international groups of standards, but it may not be enough for an EU asset manager. Is that correct?
I wouldn't comment. I couldn't give you the answer to that specific question. Perhaps.
No, sorry, I'm just using it as an example.
But yeah, I think at a high level, yeah, you do have a situation where there are going to be a number of different standards globally, and this is actually, not uncommon across, sustainability topics more broadly. And then you would expect over time to see more convergence to those and more commonality across them. But yeah, at the moment, yeah, there are some imperfections and inconsistencies. But yeah, I think it's important to not let sort of perfect be the enemy of good. And I think it's important to sort of move ahead with a framework that really helps address this paradox, where you have, so much investment products and investment funds saying that they're green or saying that they're sustainable in some way, but then, the real integrity behind that at the moment, is questionable in many cases.
Yeah. And to your point of not letting perfect get in the way of good, we've seen the EU sort of run into the sand with the social parts of its taxonomy by trying to do too much. Pip, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
The climate bond standard does generally align to the EU taxonomy in terms of climate mitigation requirements, but this is, I guess, one of these points. New Zealand could not just adopt the EU taxonomy. I think we'd find very quickly that there would be significant issues with that. I mean, we have done a project in the agricultural space here that basically started by that approach, looking at what Europe was doing under their EU taxonomy work and looking if it was applicable in New Zealand. And very quickly, land management practices are different, and basically you'll find that you can't necessarily just lift and shift, but then what you need is, I think, what the International Platform of Sustainable Finance was kind of set up to do, which is to almost be that point that says, yes, yours is different, but we understand the reason why, and potentially there is a document that's required in terms of showing the alignment in terms of the science, and the rationale behind the differences. So we understand it's different, but we still, we kind of give that certification that it still meets the level of sustainability that the EU taxonomy is looking for instance. This all sounds very complex. I guess, we always flag this as the solution for everything, but there is already, technology coming in to speed up this process. It is a bit clunky right at the moment, and it probably will be, in the very short term. But there will be technology solutions that starts to try and enable this and bring it to life and simplify some of these requirements. And I guess interoperability potentially is one of these areas where we'll hopefully find solutions that try and address this challenge.
So how do we try and help New Zealand exporting companies, many of whom are SMEs by international standards? They're being driven by their supply chains in the multinational world, in food or in other businesses, and having standards dropped down onto them. But are our smaller companies just going to struggle to keep up and to be able to continue to meet the standards that are increasingly required of them for exports? And I'll ask you, Pip, first, and then Isobel.
There is a big leap going on, I would say, to not engage in this process and not understand what this leap means and how we make it suitable for New Zealand and New Zealand businesses is probably the worst thing we could do to help our companies, I would suggest. Otherwise, as you say, David, they may be forced upon them international standards that can be very complex, that potentially aren't fit for purpose for New Zealand, that they then are needing to meet, to continue the business that they operate. The way we could probably help them is to look at what's happening internationally, work out, with a large group of stakeholders in New Zealand, what is appropriate for New Zealand, and then do our best through those international, platforms that are emerging to show that what we're doing here does meet the standards that are needed elsewhere. That's probably the best thing I can see to help our smaller businesses.
Thank you. Isobel, I know there's a limited amount you can say because of not being sort of in the trenches with private sector companies, but is there a view that you have on this?
Yeah, I think I probably just add to what Pip has said. I think that what's really great to see is that we're already going into kind of those complex policy questions that we're going to have to look at in terms of what's the form and function, what's fit for purpose for New Zealand, and this really demonstrates that it's not just an easy transfer exercise like Pip has said. So in terms of how we consider New Zealand's uniqueness, I think if we go back to how we're thinking of a taxonomy and those two different components, if you're looking at definitions, and if New Zealand is looking to develop some brand new definitions and kind of export those to something like a common ground taxonomy or something that the IPSF is working on, and looking at how different countries are already picking up those standards as almost like an intermediary standard, then I think that that's one component. And then the second component is that application. This is where the insights from industry and businesses at different scales is really important to that design and function question that will come up in the next few months as we start to look at taxonomy design and development around how do we make it fit into the process, or even expedite or support or streamline a process rather than adding too much complexity or something like that. So I think it really echoes what Pip and David have already said, but it just echoes the complexity really, that there are some difficult questions we're going to have to nut out really.
You've talked about the importance of definitions. Pip has talked about the importance of data. That those two surely are going to be absolutely key, not just for New Zealand, but for everybody else, to try and come up with something that will actually work in practice. And Pip, you said something a couple of minutes ago as well, where you talked about biodiversity. And there's been a number of people, including particularly McKinsey in a piece they put out last week, talking about how if you don't pay attention to nature and biodiversity, and admittedly, this was McKinsey interviewing the chair of the TNFD initiative, so there's only going to be one direction that'll go. But if you don't deal with biodiversity, then climate science isn't going to work particularly well anyway. Would you like to comment further on that one?
I guess I kind of bring this back to the objective of the taxonomies and etc. The purpose isn't to create red tape or complexity. It's to try and keep our economy going sustainably in the long term. And what we are now in the position of realizing is that we are coming up against many planetary boundaries at a very rapid rate all at once. So this is a very complex problem. We did speak before about, yes, this is a massive step change. But the issue is, if we don't make this step change, we either get left behind globally, or surprisingly we hit some of these planetary boundaries and we find that rather than having to address red tape, we can't do the economic activities that we've been doing full stop. And so I guess to bring this back to your question, David, we do to a degree need to deal with all these problems all at once. It's just like that movie title, isn't it? Everything, everywhere, all at once. And This is why in almost to try and deal with this complexity question, really at the moment there's like do no significant harm requirements for a lot of these areas like biodiversity, and then a significant contribution in one area. So trying to show that if you're addressing climate change, you can't make the biodiversity problem worse, or that activity still cannot be classified as sustainable because, you know, long term you're going to be creating solving one problem but creating maybe a bigger one elsewhere. The same question, very relevant in New Zealand at the moment, is resilience. You know, ex Cyclone Gabrielle, there's a lot of focus on mitigation, potentially at the cost of some focus on adaptation, and you know, how do you balance trying to do all these things all at once? But again, if you make it simple and leave things out, we're not going to be solving that problem. And if we go back to the purpose, that means we potentially are running into these planetary boundaries, which means not just red tape, that our economy can't, you know, continue the way it is.
So we're trying to get as many Oscars for a New Zealand taxonomy as that film achieved by getting all the things right. But I agree with you, it's a real balance between simplicity and complexity. And I think, you know, we'll probably find that New Zealand will have to leave the social side just to one side for the moment, because it's simply, you know, one thing too many to try and attack at the same time. And the other argument that, of course, we will get is the cost. And you alluded to it a few minutes ago, Pip, where you were talking about the aftermath of Cyclone Gabrielle. There was sort of a sense in the immediate aftermath that all the things that we were trying to do in sustainability would have to take second place if the government had to pay the sort of amounts for adaptation that were indicated in the EDS report last month. And you've had a development in Holland in the last couple of weeks where the farmer lobby has kicked back really hard against green and sustainability in the local government elections, because the Dutch government threatened to simply force down the production of dairy farming, and Holland's the second largest exporter in the world. So I think those balances and discussions, Isobel, we're going to have to, as a government, but as a private sector as well, be really careful how we address these. There's a question come up in the chat just now, which all three of you have alluded to in talking about reporting, asking how does the taxonomy relate to climate-related climate-related disclosures, and will it replace PCAF scores? David, are you the one to ask that, or is it Pip?
I can make some quick comments. I wouldn't claim expertise in all of those areas, but yeah, really a taxonomy is a disclosure tool that's primarily designed for investors. So it does require a set of disclosures coming out of companies that you know, are the destination for these investments. But you know, that's yeah, so it's not, and taxonomy will cover a number of other areas. There are likely be a number of other criteria to it. For example, in Europe, it's not just around climate; it's also looking at, you know, water and pollution and areas like this in terms of assessing if something is you know, objectively sustainable, and it's sort of science-based criteria. So no, I don't think it'll replace PCAF scores and anything CRD. It sort of augments that, and you know, companies will have to make disclosures to allow investors to, in turn, make those disclosures and put you know, the appropriate metrics onto investment products, which will be things like, you know, 16% of this fund, of the revenue of the companies in this fund, is taxonomy aligned, or 20% of the capex of the companies in this fund is taxonomy aligned. Sorry, a little bit of a jumbled answer there, so perhaps Pip can supplement it with anything.
Well, I think from what you've said, the consulting business must just be embracing this, the whole idea of a taxonomy and the opportunities for them. Pip, to that specific question on climate-related disclosures, what's your view?
The New Zealand standard requires PCAF reporting. Basically, it requires reporting Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So that will be a requirement. It does then be quite, well, it's agnostic on other metrics that you would need to report. In Europe, the way that the taxonomy has been built into mandatory reporting requirements is to say it's, if you're a company, it's a percentage of CapEx and OpEx, and if you're an investment or a fund, it's the percentage of your fund. So they potentially are, as David suggested, metrics that would sit with your financed emissions metrics. Now, really, again, like, yes, people can say that it's great for the consulting space, etc., but there's no value in reporting metrics if they have no purpose, etc. So actually, what is the purpose of this? And it is to hopefully drive strategy in the transition to a low emissions economy. So really, where this should fit in the mandatory reporting regime is under your strategy pillar in terms of your transition plan, and it can be a key metric to show how your activities are hopefully increasing in terms of the percentage of those sitting in these sustainable buckets. And that would be, I guess, my suggestion in terms of how this sits with that the mandatory requirements in New Zealand and the voluntary / becoming mandatory requirements elsewhere.
Thanks, Pip. Okay, we've only got a few minutes left, so I'd like to give each of the three of you a chance to give your 2-minute elevator pitch on why we need a taxonomy for New Zealand. Isobel, do you want to go first?
I'm happy to go first. I think that, overall, we're really aware that there are certain barriers, and like having quite a fragmented landscape and an uncertainty is really something that we can help to support to kind of remove. And so I think that's where we're coming from when we're looking at a taxonomy for New Zealand. How do we help to undo some of that and create a clear line of sight and make sure that we're really boosting the economy and supporting our transition going forwards.
Okay, thank you. Pip.
I'll be quite blunt, because we want an economy in the future, and what we've done to date probably doesn't suggest that potentially we're on the course to do that. I've moved over from the finance sector myself into this space for this reason. Historically, our investment decisions have not encompassed a broad range of outcomes, and to the detriment that we're starting to see, and science is telling us we're about to hit a brick wall. So that's my elevator pitch.
Okay, David.
Yeah, well said by the other panelists. But yeah, we're dealing with externalities and market failures in sort of economist speak. So there is a need for intervention, and there's a rapid pace of change out there in terms of this whole concept of sustainability around the corporate sector and investments. But we're lacking a bit of integrity with that at the moment, and taxonomies are a key tool for improving that integrity, even if they don't deliver perfect integrity in year one. So yes, it's complex, but sustainability is complex. And yeah, as Pip absolutely said, this is an essential challenge. It's not one that we can duck away from. And New Zealand, has an opportunity to develop a really good system. We won't be the first, but we can do one that is thought of really well, and we're going to need to do that to enable us to continue to export our products overseas into the right markets and to import the capital that we need for our economy and that current account deficit that I mentioned.
Okay, thank you, David. And of course, it's Murphy's Law that as soon as I asked the three of you to give your final pitches, questions started flooding into the chat channel, including one on the issue around data tool packages and the cost of small countries developing their own data tools, and whether it's better just for that reason to align with one of the bigger taxonomies. But I think with that and any questions that come in subsequently, we will defer them to one of the next in this series of webinars, which helps us make sure we get at least part of a future audience from the people who asked the questions this time. So thank you all three very much indeed, Isobel, Pip and David, and I'll turn it back to Joe.
Kia ora, David, and thank you, Isobel, Pip and David, and thank you all online for joining us today. I'm sure, I hope, but I'm also fairly confident that it's given you all food for thought. We are looking forward to seeing you at our part 2 webinar from 12 to 1 on Wednesday, the 24th of May. We will look at key lessons from Australia, and we'll be joined by Christy Graham, who's the Executive Officer of the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, and Nicole Yazbek-Martin, who is the head of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Project. Following this, we'll also have sessions drawing insights from Europe, UK and Asia Pacific, and we will also, in our final session, look at the application and relevance of taxonomies for iwi and Māori organisations and investors. So I look forward to seeing you all then. We appreciate your time today, and that's all, folks.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, everybody.